I'd like to talk today on the topic Capitalism, Socialism, Communism, Anarchism. Let's start with a couple of tools. Some of you may be familiar with Overton windows, possibly also with Hallan squares. They're both tools to talk about the way in which frames of reference change. I'm going to focus today on Hallan spheres, and there are three circles, an inner, a middle, and an outer. The sphere of consensus on the inside, the sphere of legitimate controversy, and then the sphere of deviance. And I'm particularly interested in the way in which things move from that outer circle, as it will, not Dante's circles, of course, the sphere of deviance into the sphere of legitimate controversy. And that is what has happened, for example, recently with the S word and even with the L word. People talk about socialism now as a viable political concept, whether it be Mr. Sanders or Ms. Ocasio-Cortez advocating democratic socialism, or whether it be Ms. Warren talking about capitalism with serious rules. There's been kind of a seismic shift, and so I'd like to think about some of the consequences of that. There have been, of course, socialists in America. Eugene Debs famously ran for president a number of years on a Socialist Party ticket the last time he was in prison. Norman Thomas between the wars and during and after World War II, both ran on the Socialist Party ticket. Bernie Sanders in 2016 ran on a socialist agenda, although he was a major party candidate for the Democratic Party. Another seismic shift that the Hallan spheres might indicate has come about from the 1960s in a tendency to think about society and politics in systemic terms. Is it any accident, comrades, as they used to ask, when a society that takes healthcare to be a privilege rather than a right, something to be earned rather than something owed, in which taxes for the rich are reduced from an effective top marginal rate of around half, that was under Eisenhower, a Republican president, to the low to mid-20s since Reagan, where they pretty much stay now. Is it any wonder that it's also a sort of society in which people are living in tents under overpasses and elsewhere in downtown Los Angeles? However, the laudable thing, the ability to see things systematically has not come without its downsides too. One of these is conspiracy theories, the notion that events are systematic always because they're deliberately planned. Another is what Karl Popper called the myth of the framework, the tendency to see bodies of ideas only as whole packages and not as packages of possibly separable component ideas. But I want to ask about separability with today's topics: capitalism, socialism, communism, anarchism. To what extent are these things alternative to each other, and to what extent may these things be compatible with each other? So let's start with capitalism first. The ism in capitalism seems to suggest that we're dealing with an ideology. Now, it's true there are ideologies that promote unbridled capitalism, laissez-faire, as it's classically called, economic deregulation toward the end of the 20th century, trickle-down economics revived during that period, and revived from a general point of view, which Karl Polanyi called market fundamentalism. And of course, that's something that operated in 19th century ideology as well as 20th. Interesting book recently, by the way, on Polanyi, Block and Summers, The Power of Market Fundamentalisms, worth a look. However, capitalism is not primarily an ism, it's an economic system, a system of producing and distributing goods. And various isms have grown up in response to it, either to promote it, to improve it, to keep it in check by countervailing power, or to abolish it. The various socialist movements have tried options 2, 3, and 4, improve it, keep it in check, or abolish it in some combination. Sometimes 2 and 3 are combined. The communist variant of socialism has pushed for option 4. Now, as an economic system, what is capitalism? Well, one of the answers that frequently springs up is it's the free market. That's an old chestnut, revived by Mr. Reagan. Supposedly, in the olden days, entrepreneurs were free to produce prosperity and progress until their hands were tied by these nasty New Deal folks who came along in mid-20th century. Problem is, governments have regulated markets even since the olden days, and usually, by the way, in favor of capitalist interests. Noam Chomsky asserts a basic principle of modern state capitalism is that cost and risk are socialized while profit is privatized. So even some ideologies that claim to be anti-socialist may actually be socialist in practice. And one sees this in American history. The government subsidies, for example, for the Erie Canal, for the railway lines, subsequently and more recently for the interstate highway system, things which make for a private profit, but which were subsidized socially by government expenditure. Another common answer that comes up when people say, when they ask, what is capitalism, is the notion of greed. This is a psychological definition. It's the Gordon Gekko definition, shall we say.
Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures. Yes. Evolutionary
spirit. One problem with this, greed is historically universal. Capitalism is historically recent. So if we're going to look for greed, why wasn't there capitalism all along? Why all of a sudden lately? Marx has a different definition of capitalism. It is a structural definition rather than a psychological one. And for Marx, capitalism is production for profit rather than for use. On Marx's view, unregulated capitalism is anarchic, and he uses this term as a Schimpfwort, as a term of abuse. We'll see, incidentally, that one can talk about anarchy in other ways as well. Unregulated capitalism for Marx is anarchic in the negative sense that there's no intrinsic reason to suspect that profit will coincide with the best interests of humanity. It will coincide simply with profit. Left to its own devices, unregulated systematic production for profit rather than for use, this is Marx's view again, results in anarchy, chaos, wastefulness, exploitation. Or, on the other hand, production might be regulated in some rational, planned way. Adam Smith famously spoke of the invisible hand of the market regulating things. One might wonder whether the invisible hand is giving many people at least the big finger. When Marx looks at capitalism, he sees two things. The first thing he sees is a system of economic exploitation, a system of unequal exchange. Famous analysis in his major work, Das Kapital. Even when workers are paid a fair wage, even when they're not being cheated, nonetheless they're being exploited, because in order for profit to occur at all, there has to be some difference between the amount of surplus value that's extracted from workers' labor and the amount of wages that are paid in compensation to that worker for the labor. Those two amounts will never be equal if profit is to be taken. And this is a viewpoint about capitalism for which Marx is best remembered among those who still remember Marx. But that wasn't all that Marx said. Marx also saw capitalism not only as a system of economic exploitation, but as an engine for economic prosperity unrivaled in human history. And it's both and for Marx. The first he found appalling, the second he found amazing. That brings us to socialism. One way the socialist movement took a leaf from Marx's book is that some socialists sought options 2 and 3 to harness the productive power of capitalism by subjugating it to democratic power. Good example from the 19th century, Edward Bernstein, famous work, Evolutionary Socialism. Democracy, he said, can and should control capitalist production. It can and should do this in a peaceful evolutionary way. In short, socialism could be democratic parliamentary socialism. And one sees attempts at this throughout the 20th century. The redistribution of wealth, pure food and drug regulations, decent employment, housing and medical care, a living wage, the right to an education. The New Deal and the labor parties in places like Britain and Scandinavia are examples of attempts to do this, to put some measure of socialism in place, but in an evolutionary democratic manner. Then that brings us to communism. Lenin looked at Bernstein and he said, really, peacefully? Who are you fooling but yourself? You know, if you try to take power from the ruling class, they will crush you. Socialism can only come about, this is Lenin's criticism of Bernstein and others, socialism can only come about via revolution, not evolution. It requires a dictatorship of the proletariat acting on behalf of the whole, whereas parliamentary democracy is doomed to fail. The masses of the workers cannot achieve revolution spontaneously. They have to be nudged, and they have to be nudged by a conspiratorial vanguard party. This is how he saw his party, the Bolsheviks. Once in party, this is Lenin's view, once in power, the party will rule on behalf of the will of the people. Only once socialism has been created, then the state or government can wither away, to use a phrase of Marx's companion Engels. So communism is a variant of socialism, but it's one in which says capitalism cannot be tamed; it can only be abolished. And so any attempt to promote it, improve it, keep it in check by countervailing power is counterproductive. Revolutionary abolition of capitalism is the only way. Well, is socialism then compatible with capitalism? Bernstein and other democratic socialists would say yes, at least it's possible. If votes can be made fair, and the 99% can outvote the 1%. Lenin and communist socialists say no, they're not compatible. It's impossible to put them together. Socialism can come about only by non-democratic revolutionary abolition of capitalism. So it's kind of like Malcolm X said, is it the ballot or is it the bullet? Bernstein's view, if voting can be fair, the 99% will have their say. Lenin's view, the 1% is going to have its thumb on the scales. Well, and then there's this prospect. Does socialism, whether communist socialism or democratic socialism, lead to everyone wearing identical blue uniforms? Does it lead on the road to serfdom? Are we heading toward being sheeple? In communism, people wait in breadlines. In capitalism, breadlines wait for you. Comrade Crunch, not feeding the people very well. Communism has a dismal record where it's been practiced vis-a-vis human welfare, and uniformity and sheepleness, of course, is part of that. On the other hand, Hans Eichelbohm, a photographer still working, has been documenting the manner in which capitalism also ends up producing blue-jacketed sheeple. Is it possible that these people all see themselves as expressing their unique identities through their choices in the fashion market? Is communism the only variant of socialism? Would socialism make us inevitably Maoist worker bees, make us sheeple? Some people are still confused about that. Bill Maher in 2019, and Julian Castro, who was then running for president on the Democratic ticket, on the show. And basically, Castro begins by saying, socialism is when the government owns the means of production. And Maher calls him on this. Aren't you conflating socialism with communism? Let's get straight what socialism is. And Maher tries to do this. Let me show you a couple of clips from his program. One from 2016, the last presidential election, and one from 2019, the year up to the current election. Maher tries to explain how we can think of socialism as a supplement or as a corrective to capitalism rather than as a replacement for it.
And finally, new rule, everyone has to admit that even though Bernie Sanders didn't win the nomination, he's already won the future. Now, last week in this space, I talked about how socialism was something America needs more of to curtail capitalism, because the profit motive creates horrible incentives like keeping people sick, putting too many of them in jail, always being at war, and treating a woman touching Donald Trump's hair as breaking news. But let's not romanticize socialism the way conservatives romanticize capitalism. These are economic systems, not your first kiss. So if you say, the word socialism to people under 40, the reaction is night and day from that of baby boomers, for whom socialism has always been seen as communism's gay cousin. But for millennials, the word socialism doesn't conjure up images of Stalin and Castro. It conjures up images of naked Danish people on a month-long paid vacation. And
then subsequently,
finally, new
Oops,
rule.
let's go to the other one.
All right, and finally, new rule. Republicans have to explain if socialism is such a one-way ticket to becoming the nightmare of Venezuela, then why do all the happiest countries in the world embrace it? The UN just came out with their annual World Happiness Rankings, and the top ones are all socialist-friendly places, like Finland and Norway, Denmark and Iceland, Switzerland, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Canada, and of course, Wakanda. The right has a hard time understanding the concept that we don't want long lines for bread socialism. We want, you don't have to win the lotto to afford brain surgery socialism. Socialism as an economic model replacing capitalism is bad, but socialism as a supplement to capitalism, good. Kind of like how gin and tonic are terrible by themselves, but mixed together, delightful. All right.
So, capitalism and socialism, like gin and tonic. I'm not sure which is the gin and which is the tonic, but I think you get the point. Bernstein says socialism is compatible with parliamentary democracy, regulating capitalism. Senator Warren, on the other hand, says she's not for socialism, rather she's for capitalism with serious rules. I'm not sure I see that there is a distinction with a difference here. Aren't they drinking the same gin and tonic, maybe just in different proportions? And then we come to the third point in R4, anarchism. Anarchism symbolized by, we see this a lot, a red letter A circled with a red letter O. This comes from Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who said basically anarchy is order, so the A and the O. La société cherche l'ordre, donc l'anarchie. Spontaneous order, though, rather than central imposed or top-down order. So for Proudhon and for the anarchist tradition generally, order is not synonymous with government. Anarchy is not synonymous with chaos, as, for example, Marx tends to suggest. There's no government, like no government. That's the anarchist take. Now, during the 19th century, in the first International Workingmen's Association, Karl Marx was pitted against Mikhail Bakunin. Marx, the socialist, the communist, and Bakunin, the anarchist. They were seen as rivals, and the two views have been seen as alternatives. Anarchism promoted the spontaneous direct action of the lumpenproletariat, the very most wretched of the earth, bottom up, not top down. Marx championed the action of the working class, the proletariat. Typically, anarchists contest against Marxists or any other political tendency for that matter. They contest the importance of state government or power. Here's something worth quoting from Bakunin. They, the Marxists, maintain that only a dictatorship, their dictatorship, of course, can create the will of the people, while our answer to this is no dictatorship can have any other aim but that of self-perpetuation, and it can beget only slavery in the people tolerating it. Freedom can be created only by freedom, that is by universal rebellion on the part of the people and free organization of the toiling masses from the bottom up. And so this is a big issue. It eventually broke up the First International. Noam Chomsky, who is still with us today, the leading living political exponent of anarchism, notes that anarchists have gotten a very bad reputation. A French writer, as he says, sympathetic to anarchism, wrote in the 1890s that, quote, anarchism has a broad back, like paper it endures anything, unquote, including those, he noted, whose acts are such that a mortal enemy of anarchism could not have done. The bomb, as much as the circle, the O circling the A, has become the symbol of anarchists. And you see in 19th century cartoons, Thomas Nast and others, the typical anarchist is a guy about ready to throw a bomb, a lumpen proletariat who wants death and destruction. But anarchism, as Chomsky and other anarchists would argue, is not necessarily violent, not necessarily terrorist. It opposes government. Again, order is not the same thing as government. We can have social order without it having to have it imposed top down. And so, unlike democratic socialism, anarchism is not going to recommend that the government state should recognize capitalism and compensate for its flaws. Nonetheless, we might still ask, is anarchism compatible with capitalism, with socialism, with communism? I think the beginning of wisdom about anarchism is to realize that it's not a strict alternative to socialism, either the democratic or the non-democratic versions. It's not a strict alternative to Marxism either. Marxism has the sociology of power, and Marxism has an economic analysis. Anarchism typically has neither. It might best be appreciated, I think, anarchism as a philosophy of protest. And in this way, its scope would be much more restricted than is, for example, the scope of Marxism. Correspondingly, its base of support might be broader for the narrowness of scope. Anybody can protest too much control. Anybody who objects to bureaucracy, no matter what their class background or occupation, or who might be thought of as an anarchist. This is one face of anarchist protest. People wearing those Guy Fawkes masks, trashing the world, WTO. It may not be the only face. Here's another face. Rosa Luxemburg, who was a democratic socialist and opponent of Lenin in the early part of the 20th century. She was murdered just about a century ago after World War I. But she doesn't use this term, but she thinks basically that what's happening with the Bolsheviks is goal displacement. And that's not a good thing. Lenin thinks that a conspiratorial vanguard party and a dictatorship of the proletariat is the only means to abolish capitalism and bring about justice. But what if the means to an end becomes an end in itself? And are we supposed to believe that central power, once in place, will simply wither away once the Bolsheviks get control? They'll simply put themselves out of business. Who is Lenin kidding but himself? What's the point of having a revolution? And she said this over and over again. If all that changes is the replacement of a capitalist dictatorship by a red dictatorship. Red Rosa, as they called her, a leading socialist critic of the Bolsheviks. Now, socialists like Red Rosa protesting party centralization sounds a lot like Bakunin. A bourgeois person protesting bureaucratization, goal displacement, paternalism, authoritarianism might also be an anarchist. One of the leading anarchists in the 19th century was a Russian prince, Prince Kropotkin. In the 20th century, leading anarchist is Noam Chomsky, professor at MIT. Prince Kropotkin was both an anarchist and a communist, as were many of the opponents of Francisco Franco, for example, during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. There are even people today who call themselves capitalist anarchists, that anarchism can be combined with capitalism. Their symbol, of course, is black for anarchism and gold for capitalism, of course. There's anarcho-feminism, there's green anarchism, there's mutualism, etc. And of course, one usually faces the question, as with libertarians generally, are these folks left-wing or right-wing? How does anarcho-capitalism differ from simple laissez-faire? It's an interesting set of questions. But in conclusion, I would ask, do we need to be bound by a particular myth of the framework which says, for example, socialism or capitalism, choose. Marx or Bakunin, choose. Dialectical materialism or Western sociology, choose. Revolution or misery, choose. Laissez-faire capitalism or the road to socialist serfdom, choose. Maybe these questions are not at all inevitable. Maybe it's worth thinking about capitalism, socialism, anarchism, communism in their own rights, and asking whether or not there is a possible compatibility among any or all of them. Well, is it time for happy hour then? Thank you. My name is Michael Cavanaugh, and I've been talking to you today about capitalism, socialism, communism, and anarchism.